that God is everything. That would be the other main worldview. There's really four main other ones, but we're not really, or four other ones that we don't really need to cover at this point. But these are your three main ones. And if you look at the world's religions, most of them fall in one of these three categories. They do. I mean, Hinduism typically falls within pantheism. Buddhism can fit with either atheism or pantheism. Does have some theistic elements depending on its specific development. But you're left with your three main theistic worldviews: Christianity, Judaism, Islam. Historically, you've also had one other view, which is why this talk is important, which is called deism. And deism was this development that took place, especially in the wake of the scientific revolution in the 17th and 18th century, where the notion of what type of universe we live in was no longer seen as being, for lack of a better term, haunted by various spirits. Because prior to that, we lived in a quite superstitious world in a lot of ways, because you would see this natural phenomena, but your explanation for it tended to be a highly religiously charged explanation. How do you account for lightning? Well, it'd be God or Zeus or somebody was angry at somebody and they'd send their thunderbolts down. How do you explain a shooting star? Well, those would be various angels that are falling from heaven. Well, what happens to the religious explanation whenever you can give a natural explanation? We can explain lightning through the electromagnetic discharge in the atmosphere. Well, the religious explanation kind of goes to the wayside. Well, how do we explain shooting stars? Well, there are meteorites hitting the atmosphere as well. Well, what happens to the religious explanation? It gets pushed to the side. So what you ended up it was this situation where God got pushed further and further to the edges of our understanding of nature, that many people started wondering if God was there at all, number one. But number two, they were like, well, what role does God play at all? Because you had a lot of people, they weren't really ready to jettison the idea of God. They really wanted to keep God, but they're like, what role does he play in the universe? Given our understanding of how physics is coming along and the unveiling that we have of nature seems to be so secure and so absolute, we don't need God anymore. And so, for example, like Thomas Jefferson, he wrote, or I should say edited, his own version of the Gospels. I think Frank even mentioned that in one of these videos. And it's called The Ministry and Morals of Jesus. And what he did is he went through the Gospels, he cut out all of the miraculous accounts, because he's like, oh, miracles don't happen. What really matters is the morality that's taught in the Gospels. It's the morality of Jesus that matters. It's not so much the actual miraculous accounts. His sacrificial death and resurrection are actually irrelevant to the life of Christ. That was what he was teaching. And that was in line with a mindset that a lot of people had at that time. God has been pushed so far out to the side because of our advances in science, we no longer need God to explain things that are happening in the world. And so the idea of the universe being this giant clock was taken quite seriously. God created the universe, winds it up like a clock, lets it go, and never interferes. What room is there for a miracle then? There isn't one. All right, so that's kind of the setup for what we're going to be looking at today. And I'm going to go ahead and jump to the conclusion in a lot of ways, just because it'll help us frame the rest of the discussion as well. The only way you can actually disprove a miracle is to actually show God doesn't exist. Because if God exists, miracles are at least possible. That's really kind of the conclusion we're going to be working toward for this particular session. And that's what's going to lead into the next couple weeks, is this idea that, well, do we have any historical evidences of a miracle? This is why it's going to be important to look at the New Testament. Is it a historically reliable account of not only the life of Christ, but also the early church, as well as the miraculous events that it claims to have taken place? So that's what we'll be starting next week, is this idea of the New Testament. And so we have this bridge. How do we get from these ideas that God exists to the New Testament itself and the importance of what a miracle plays? You can even read in Scripture where it talks about the importance of miracles and what role they might possibly have. So, for example, in Deuteronomy 10, verse 21, it says, "He is your praise, he is your God, who has done for you these great and terrifying things that your eyes have seen." So here you have Moses talking to the children of Israel, and what are the great and terrifying things they've seen? It's all the miracles that have led them up to this point, right before they go into the land of Canaan. They've seen the parting of the Red Sea. They saw the plagues that God visited upon Egypt. Right? They've seen the various miracles that God has done. What did Nicodemus, what is the first thing he says to Jesus when he has the Nick at Night episode in John 3? He comes to Jesus at night because he's really intrigued about this teacher. And what does he say? "We know that you are a man from God because no one can do the signs he does unless God is with him." No one can do the things that he does unless God is with him. It's like they recognized that there was this aspect of the actions that Jesus was doing could only take place if God were there, if God were working through it. Now, all of this is based off the idea of we got to understand what a miracle is in the first place. Why should we expect, or why were the children of Israel able to see these great and terrifying things? How did Nicodemus understand these signs and wonders that Jesus was doing? What makes them signs and wonders? And so that's why we need to try and define what we mean by miracle. Which creates a problem in a lot of ways, because we tend to, in our modern day, we tend to use the term miracle incorrectly. We end up using it in situations that aren't technically miracles, but I'm not going to argue with you. It's like, the birth of a child is amazing, but is it really a miracle? I don't want to put cold water on anybody, right? Because the birth of a child is something that is amazing. Whenever the child takes its first breath, it went from non-breathing to now breathing. That's amazing. But you don't need a deity in order to explain that process. As amazing as it is, you don't need that. And so whenever we use the term miracle, it's not used in any technical sense. And so, at least for the apologetic process, what we want to try to do is utilize the term miracle in a technical sense. So in our common everyday language, if you want to use the term miracle, that's fine. But whenever we talk about this right here, how do we identify miracles, especially as they come through in Scripture, we really want to be careful what we're talking about. Okay. So here's where we're going to start moving really quickly. And it starts like this. Pretend for a moment that God exists. How would God communicate to people? If you were in charge, somehow you find yourself to be God over all things. And some people might see themselves as God over all things, but they're really not. How would you want to communicate with people? How could you do it? Say what now?
Writing it down.
Well, does God write it down?
Yes.
You could use humans. You could use somebody else. You could get visions. Really, there's two main ways that God could communicate to people. Number one, he could communicate with everybody individually. This has one great benefit, but one great drawback. If he communicated with everybody individually directly, you would be able to deliver his will to everybody directly, right? I mean, that is one great benefit, but the main drawback is this would greatly limit your free will. Because the one thing that you would not be free to do, you might still rebel against God, but one thing you could not do is actually believe God doesn't exist. You can't disbelieve something you know to be true. Who in here believes that 2 + 2 equals something other than 4? None of you. You all know that it equals 4. So even if you were to go out and make the statement, I think 2 + 2 equals 79, well, guess what? I don't think you really believe that. You wouldn't really believe it either, because you know it equals 4. You are not free to believe things that you know are true. And so if God were to communicate with everybody indirectly, through dreams, visions, actual audible voice, whatever it is, you would not be free to believe that God doesn't exist. So there would be this type of limitation on your freedom. The second way God could communicate is to use representatives through prophets, who he doesn't allow them not to think God doesn't exist. But whenever you do that, you greatly preserve the vast majority of free will of humans. You can still communicate your message, but it has one great drawback, is that some people simply aren't going to accept that message. No matter what happens, they simply will not accept it. And we see that. You have people, they know that God is working, they know that Jesus has the power of God in him, and yet what do many of the Pharisees do? Still don't accept it. You even have that great parable by Jesus. He talks about Lazarus finds himself in hell, and it's just great torment, and he's got this this great chasm, and so he goes, can you just dip your finger in water and touch my tongue? No, the chasm is set. All right, well, can you go and tell my brothers? Go tell my brothers to avoid this place. For surely if somebody came back from the dead, they would believe. No, even if somebody returns from the dead, some people simply won't believe. All right. So now, in God's wisdom, out of these two main ways that he has seen possible to communicate, he has chosen the second option, using representatives to deliver his will, preserving the large measure of freedom that we have to believe or not believe, to respond or not respond. But it comes with the side effect that some people simply will not believe. They will not accept the message. All right, so moving a little bit more quickly now. I do think that skeptics are right to demand proofs and miracles, or proof that God has communicated. Because if anybody just comes along and says, hey, God said X, Y, Z, why should I believe him? Whenever the Muslim says, hey, you know what, God has communicated through Muhammad, why should I believe that? Right? Whenever the Christian says that God is in the person of Christ, in the flesh, why should we believe that? Why should we believe whenever somebody just says, God told me X, Y, Z? What is the confirmation that you can give that God has actually given you this message? And so whenever we talk about acts of God, we're talking about those ideas that are going to be the fingerprints of God. They're going to be the identifiable actions that can say, only God can do this. Likewise, it needs to be consistent with what God has already done previously. Because if you end up with contradictory ideas, not kind of a progression of actions, but contradictory ideas, are you dealing with the same deity at that point? Are you dealing with the same God if you've got contradictory teachings, contradictory notions that are both being confirmed by miracles? That's way more difficult to identify. So there needs to be this kind of broad consistency, but it needs to be something identifiable that only God can do. And so the beginning part of our definition, you'll see at the bottom of the screen there, is a miracle is a special act of God that interrupts the normal course of events. And this is really similar to a definition or an understanding that Antony Flew, the famous atheist, gave, I believe it was in Philosophy of Religion, his section on miracles, which is interesting to have an atheist write about miracles. But in there, he gives actually a pretty good understanding. He goes, a miracle is an event that, given the normal course of nature, as it were, would not happen. It's never going to happen just by nature working itself out as it normally does. A miracle is this kind of extra input from an outside force, an outside agency that is changing the way that we perceive nature. It's actually not too bad for a starting understanding of what a miracle might be. So it's not just an unusual event, it's something that would not and could not happen without an outside agent. So the reason why God gives miracles is so he can communicate his message. He can confirm prophecies and validate his prophets. And so a full working definition of miracle is going to be this idea that whenever we talk about a miracle in a very particular sense, we're talking about a special act of God that interrupts the normal course of events to confirm a word of God through a messenger of God. This is why it's so significant that Nicodemus comes to Jesus and says, we know that you are from God because no one can do the things he does unless God is with him. So what do you do whenever somebody that you know is from God is challenging you on your beliefs and behavior? Do you accept him or do you reject him? That's the challenge that's going to be before you. Now, as you remember in the video that you watched with Frank, he goes, look, How believable are miracles? You read the Bible, it's full of all these kind of odd stories, right? You got axe heads floating, you got people walking on, you got one person walking on water, you got healings, you got people being raised from the dead, you got blind people seeing, deaf people hearing. You have all of these amazing events taking place. You got prophecies that are being given hundreds of years in advance being fulfilled. How do we make sense of this? And he basically says, how believable is it? Well, it depends. If you can believe Genesis 1:1, how easy is it to believe the rest of the miracles? The hard one's already been complete. And that's really what it comes down to. If you can accept the idea that God created the heavens and the earth, everything else in the Bible is at least believable. Because if you think God can create something, how easy is it going to be for him to manipulate something within that creation? Not too hard. Think of it like this right here. If you saw me run across the front right here, you're not going to see that because I'll get winded very quickly. But if I ran across, you're like, man, I just saw him run across the front of the stage. Number one, you'd be very impressed. But number two, what if I say, oh, also, did you see him walk across the stage? Would that be believable? Well, we did see him run. Walking is a lot easier. Same thing here. If you can create a universe, something out of nothing, how hard is it going to be to make an axe head float? How easy is it going to be to send fire from heaven? How easy is it going to make the blind see and the deaf hear? Way easier. So if you can actually believe Genesis 1:1, everything else in the Bible is believable. Because the greatest miracle itself, creation, might not be the most significant for our personal existential relationship with God. That's going to be like the resurrection.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, ma'am.
Does it have to be through a messenger of God?
The way that we're just using the term here is because we're gearing up for how do we understand the New Testament. Or the question was, does a miracle have to be through a messenger of God? No. Technically, no. Because it's an action of God working through there. The reason why we're just using this idea of a messenger of God to deliver a message of God is because we're trying to identify, okay, what is it that God is doing? What is he trying to tell us? And so it has more of an emphasis related to, do we understand God's will? And whenever you have something like what we've been looking at the past couple of weeks in regards to general revelation, the idea that we can know that God exists, we can know certain things about not only his existence and his nature, it's also very limited. So by studying nature, we can identify that God exists, that he's omnipotent, that he's omniscient, he's spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal. We can run down through all of those things. He's moral. We can get all that. But does it tell us anything about the Trinity? No. Does it say anything about the plan of salvation written in the stars? No. And so that's what we're talking about. Those type of messages that God wants to give to us would have to be through a messenger, or it would have to be direct, either way. That's something that he would have to tell us in special revelation. And so that's why we're gearing up with the idea of miracle here, is this idea of special revelation. But you are right. God can do a miracle without a messenger. He totally did there in the very beginning. Yeah. Does that help? Okay. So yeah, the only way to prove that miracles aren't possible is to prove God doesn't exist. And I do want to read this. Unfortunately, it's a fairly lengthy passage from G.K. Chesterton, but he's going to really, I really just like the way this is worded. And what he explains here really nicely is the type of circular reasoning that the skeptic ends up utilizing. So when people say that miracles not only don't happen, but have never happened, how do they know? How would you know? You have to assume from the start that they haven't happened and can't happen. So who's really open to evidence? If somebody makes a claim on a miracle, who's actually saying, well, let's investigate it? Is the skeptic really open to investigating a miracle claim? All right, so I know that this is fairly lengthy, but I think he just words this so well. He says, but my belief in miracles have happened in human history is not a mystical belief at all. I believe in them upon human evidences as I do in the discovery of America. Remember, he's writing at like the beginning of the 20th century, so this is over 100 years ago. Upon this point, there is a simple logical fact that only requires to be stated and cleared up. Somehow or other, an extraordinary idea has arisen that the disbelievers in miracles consider them coldly and fairly, while believers in miracles accept them only in connection with some dogma. The fact is quite the other way around. The believers in miracles accept them rightly or wrongly because we have the evidence for them. The disbelievers in miracles deny them rightly or wrongly because they have a doctrine against them. The open, obvious, democratic thing to believe is an old apple woman when she bears testimony to a miracle, just as you believe an old apple woman when she bears testimony to a murder. If it comes to human testimony, there is a choking cataract of human testimony in favor of the supernatural. If you reject it, it can only mean one of two things. You reject the peasant story about the ghost either because the man is a peasant or because the story is a ghost story. That is, you either deny the main principle of democracy or you affirm the main principle of materialism, that is, the abstract impossibility of miracles. You have a perfect right to do so, but in that case, you are the dogmatist. It is we Christians who accept all actual evidence. It is you rationalists who refuse the actual evidence of being constrained to do so by your own creed. But I am not constrained by any creed in the matter in looking impartially into certain miracles of medieval and modern times. I have come to the conclusion that they have occurred. All argument against these plain facts is always an argument in a circle. If I say medieval documents attest certain miracles as much as they attest to certain battles, they answer, but medievals were superstitious. If I want to know in what they were superstitious, the only ultimate answer is that they believed in miracles. So if I say a peasant saw a ghost, I am told, but peasants are so credulous. And if I ask, why credulous? The only answer is that they see ghosts. Iceland is impossible because only stupid sailors have seen it. And the sailors are only stupid because they have said they have seen Iceland. When it comes to miracles, this is really the issue. People just assume that they don't happen. I mentioned this, it was last week or a couple weeks prior when we were looking at the issue related to the arguments for where does life come from. Why do modern skeptical scholars date the Gospel of Mark after 70 AD? Does anybody remember? Why is the Gospel of Mark dated after 70 AD? Destruction of Jerusalem. Specifically, the destruction of the temple, which takes place in 70 AD. You have Titus, he comes through, he totally cleans house because of the rebellion from 66 AD and so forth. But remember that statement in Mark 13, where the disciples are marveling at the temple, and what does Jesus say? Not one of these stones is going to remain standing. Think about this for a moment. The main reason why skeptical scholars date the Gospel of Mark after 70 AD is because there is said to be a predictive prophecy by Jesus about the destruction of the temple. Well, wait a minute. And we know that, this is the way the skeptical scholar thinks, and we know that predictive prophecy isn't possible, so it must have been written after 70 AD. That's how the reasoning works. Despite whatever evidence to the contrary that you can show, and we're going to try and get into that in the next couple of weeks, trying to show that actually there's probably pretty good reason for thinking Mark may have been written in the 60s. There's actually a pretty good reason thinking that Matthew may have also been written in like the late 50s or early 60s as well as the Gospel of Luke. We're going to get into that. But the main reason why you see modern scholarship say that these have to be post-70 is because of that one predictive prophecy. And we know that predictive prophecy doesn't work because we don't have evidence of any predictive prophecy coming true. Well, wait a minute. How are we not just arguing in a circle? Are we just the stupid sailors that have seen Iceland or not? I mean, it's really the problem that we have. And so it's only by denying the possibility of predictive principles that we say that Mark was written after 70 AD. But that just seems to assume everything that we're trying to show. Right? If you're a skeptic, you're just trying to just assume. And I do have to say, just as a matter of principle, it's a lot easier to win your argument if you just assume your position is true. Right? I mean, that seems to be how things are going. All right, so we've already talked about this a little bit, but the God that created the universe can easily part the Red Sea, can send fire from heaven, heal the sick, raise the dead. Again, none of this says that these things have happened, but all we're trying to do is just argue that it can happen.
What we need to do is see evidence. So if somebody's going to make a miraculous claim, I don't care what religion you're in, whether it's Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, whatever, I need to be open to it. Is this something that's possible? And of course, if I'm an atheist, the answer is always and forever going to be no. But as a theist, maybe. I'm at least open to hearing what your case is. Okay. So one of the main arguments, and this is certainly not the only one, but one of the most popular arguments against miracles, and this is what Frank spends most of his video on, so I'm just going to do a cut-down version of it, because I really want to get to the end about what are the different aspects of identifying a miracle that I think are important. So David Hume was the great Scottish skeptic, and he gives an argument against the believability of miracles. And it's an interesting argument because, strangely enough, he doesn't actually argue that miracles are impossible. He doesn't argue that they haven't happened or couldn't happen. What he says is that even if they have happened, you shouldn't believe it. Which is like the oddest thing to actually hold. So any type of unusual event, he says, you should believe doesn't happen. He goes, look, natural laws by definition describe regular occurrence. I think a lot of people are going to agree with that. That's what a natural law is. We're just describing the way nature works. You know, you drop something, gravity is just pulling it to the ground. That's a natural occurrence, natural law. Miracles, by definition, are rare occurrences. Again, most theists are actually going to probably agree with that. If miracles happened all the time, we would probably just consider them another type of natural law or something, because it might happen with some sort of regularity. I mean, even, and Frank brings this up too, one of the issues that can, not so much confuse us, but can actually kind of color this type of, this discussion, is that when you read the Bible, miracles happen like all the time in the Bible, or at least it seems that way. Again, you only got about, 250, 300 miracles that are discussed in Scripture, but because they happen on every other page, you get this sense that they happen with great regularity, but they don't. How many times does Abraham talk to God? Or I should say, how many times does God talk directly with Abraham? Now, in the span of a few pages, you cover, 100 years of Abraham's life. How many times does God talk to him in that time span? 3? It's very rare. In fact, and this was the point, it's like whenever you look at like the bulk of miracles that have taken place in the biblical story, they really kind of coalesce around 3 major figures. You have the ministry, or three time periods. You have the ministry of Moses, the ministry of Elijah and Elisha, and then the ministry of Jesus and his apostles. That's not to say that miracles haven't happened elsewhere. You certainly have the other prophets that are receiving visions. Certainly you do have like the creation account itself would be like one of the big ones. Right, so you do have miracles happen throughout, but whenever you look at the regularity of them, it's really only these 3 short time periods that they've happened. So this is a rare event. And again, that's not saying that they can't even happen today or that they don't happen today. I'm not saying that. But they are rare. Now here's the key premise for Hume. He says, the evidence for the regular is always going to be greater than that for the rare. And if you're going to be a wise man, you will always base your belief on the greater evidence. As such, the wise man will never believe in a miracle. Doesn't that seem weird? I want to be a wise man. Well, then you should never believe in a miracle. But is that really wise?
No.
No, of course not. Because what if they happen? Which is, of course, the whole point. So a couple of things that you can say to Hume here. Number one, the evidence for the regular is not always greater than that for the rare. For example, there are many rare events. Many times you can say just one event. How many times have you been born? Once. How many times has the universe been created? Once. New forms of life? Once. Significant historical events? I put, births, deaths, Waterloo, founding of America, stuff like that. Once. In other words, if Hume is right, then any significant historical event should not be believed. Which is, again, I find just to be a really odd position for him to take. But look what he's trying to do. He's trying to actually discredit the miraculous accounts that you see in the Bible. That's really what he's after. You need to be skeptical of it. You need to prove your case that these things have happened, but he's kind of already ruled out that you could even believe it. In many ways, what Hume does is he confuses possibility and believability. The possibility is saying that something is able to happen. It's not contradictory for something to happen. Believability is the likelihood of it. And what he's doing is he's saying, look, even if it's possible, you shouldn't believe it. But again, that's really weird. The odds of you winning the lottery are what? 1 in 300 million or so? But if you happen to win the lottery, should you say, I guess I don't get the money? Can't happen to me. Because the probability of me winning is so low, I guess I'm not going to win the Mega Million jackpot. And so Hume's odd statement here actually holds that even if you witness a miracle, you shouldn't believe it happened. Man, did you see that guy walk on water? No. That didn't happen. Couldn't happen. Nobody. Until we see it happen again. But as soon as you see it happen again, what is he going to say? Oh, it must be some natural law. The thing is, we live our lives based off of what actually happens, not what normally happens. It might normally be the case that you act in one way, but you know, it only takes one significant event for you to change your mind on certain things. It might normally be the case that when people are crucified and buried, they stay dead. Why does Thomas not believe the reports from the other disciples? Well, because whenever you see somebody crucified and you bury them, they stay dead. What it took was an actual miracle. It took an actual resurrection to get him to change his mind. And in history, or I should say church tradition, tells us that then Thomas went on to, he made his way out to India, as how the tradition holds, and there he was martyred for his belief in Christ's resurrection. A couple other things about Hume. It needs to be remembered that what he's doing is he's just adding evidence together. He's putting in one column over here all of the normal events of history, then he's putting all the miraculous events over here, and of course that's going to be a much shorter list than all of the normal events. He says, look, if you just put it on a scale of normal to miraculous, the normal is just going to outweigh it every single time. Well, if that's how you're counting evidence, sure, but is that how you're supposed to be counting this type of evidence? Why does sane and sober eyewitness testimony not count? 2 hole-in-ones. Anybody here play golf besides me? Well, I should say, like to play golf besides me? I don't really get to very much. Time-consuming and expensive, both of those. But if you've ever played golf, it's really hard to get a hole-in-one, right? And yet, people have had 2 hole-in-ones in the same round. I've actually been witness to 2 hole-in-ones at back-to-back. Yeah, this was televised. It was this was at the Masters tournament. What was it? 2004, 2005. One group right there, and one guy hit. What was it? Kurt Triplett was one of the guys. I can't remember who the other was off the top of my head. One guy was hitting second in one group, hit a hole-in-one on 16 at Augusta. First guy in the next group comes up, hits a hole-in-one. Now that's a super rare occurrence. Therefore, according to Hume, it never happened. Is that really rational? I think we all know that it's not. It just turns out that if you're going to take those type of events, you're never going to accept the miraculous. But of course, that's like one of the most irrational things you can do if you actually witness something and then deny it actually happens. I don't know how you get more irrational than that. And so C.S. Lewis put it this way in his criticism of Hume, and it'll be very similar to that G.K. Chesterton quote. He says, now of course we must agree with Hume that if there is absolutely uniform experience against miracles, if in other words they have never happened, why then they never happened. Unfortunately, we know the experience against them to be uniform only if we know that all reports of them are false. And we can know all the reports to be false only if we know already that miracles have never occurred. In fact, we are arguing in a circle. All right. So that's kind of the main argument against Hume. He ends up confusing believability and possibility. He adds evidence. He doesn't really weigh the evidence so much. And he just basically declares that, hey, you know what? The only type of believable events are those that are regular occurrences, which of course is just circular reasoning. The odd truth is that if Hume is right, even if you witness a miracle, you shouldn't believe it. All right. So that's the main argument that you'll see people use. Again, it's not the only argument against miracles that you'll see. Benedict Spinoza has one of the more classic ones where he just basically says that miracles are just defined as being impossible because they're contradictions to nature. He basically says natural law can't be violated, and miracles violate natural laws, therefore miracles don't happen. But of course, that's also arguing in a circle. That just presupposes that miracles are impossible. All right. Now, there are 6 terms that we need to identify as we begin looking at miracles. So here's where we're kind of bringing everything together. What is it that we're looking for to be able to identify as a miracle? And so 6 terms that you'll have that you'll want to distinguish between. Number 1, you have anomalies. These would be kind of an unexplained but natural event. It's not necessarily tied to any sort of purpose or telos, teleology. It doesn't have anything necessarily behind it. It's just something happens that we don't really quite know why. Could be miraculous, but it's not. And so an anomaly actually is a natural occurrence. We just don't know why yet. You have magic. And I don't mean magic with the CK, like spiritual powers. I mean magic here, like just sleight of hand. Your David Copperfields of the world. These would be just tricks of the mind, that the hand is quicker than the eye type thing. You use psychology as well as distraction in order to make an amazing occurrence happen. But of course, if you've ever done magic, you understand that there's not actually anything supernatural going on. And once you have the trick revealed to you, it loses its amazement, right? I'm going to go ahead and spoil one, unless somebody doesn't want me to spoil you, pulling a rabbit out of a hat. Is anybody saying, like, man, how did they ever pull a rabbit out of the hat? You had a top hat, there was nothing in it, he puts it on the desk, he reaches his hand in, and voila, he pulls out a rabbit. You've seen it? I remember seeing that as a kid. I was like, how did he do that, right? That's amazing. Miracle. Well, no. There's actually multiple ways that you can do that type of trick. And once you know it, it loses its luster. Right? This is why, magicians are so loath to reveal their secrets, because they want to maintain the mystery. How did you do that? That's what makes it interesting. It's like, I got to tell you, there's some magicians I've seen, I'm pretty sure they're working with Satan. Just because it is just so, it's so amazing what they're doing. You're like, I know there's a rational way of doing this, right? I just can't figure it out, right? And that's, of course, that's the whole point of magic. But with magic, sleight of hand, there isn't anything supernatural going on. It's just a trick of the mind. Psychosomatic events. These are issues where it's a natural event, but it's the mind's ability to actually overcome or have certain effects on the body. And so it's just one of those interesting facts in psychology and in medicine that people with good attitudes towards their illness tend to actually have better recovery rates than those that are really pessimistic. There is this kind of psychosomatic effect on your recovery rates. But it's just, as far as we can tell, largely natural. It doesn't necessarily include a type of supernatural agent behind it all. Then you have satanic signs. These are actually supernatural events, but they do have a purpose, namely to lead away from God. What makes the satanic signs so intriguing for a lot of people is because it is a supernatural event. They're like, oh man, this is a power that is beyond nature itself. This must be what God is, even though it's leading away from God. That's why the man in Revelation is going to be so dangerous, because he's going to be doing supernatural signs. Even though it's leading away from God, people are going to be led astray. Then you get to the last two. You have providence. Providence are these indirect events. It's these kind of indirect event by God. It's pre-purposed. It's extraordinary, but it's not necessarily identifiable as a direct miracle. I'll give you an example of that one in moments. And then you get to the last one, which is miracle, which we're trying to use in its very specific effect. Is this idea of a supernatural event which is explicitly supposed to show the purpose show purpose behind it, and to lead to God. This is why you have this idea of trying to confirm a message of God through a messenger of God. When Jesus says, "Hey, you know what? I am the vine, I am the branches." Whenever he gives those type of commands, it throws the Pharisees into an epileptic fit, right? I mean, they just go, apoplectic. They just get really upset with him. Why? Because he's making claims about himself. They're like, nobody should be making those type of claims. And yet, what does he do in order to show this? He goes out and heals people. He does something only God can do in order to verify the claims that he makes. And it drives them crazy. They really don't like this. All right, so let's look at a couple of examples. So let's try and chart these out a little bit. So an anomaly would be something like, a description would be like a freak of nature, right? Something that we don't really understand. But its power is just simply natural. We just don't understand it yet. It might have a pattern to it. It also may not. So you can have like singular events that take place. One of the examples was, it's only been fairly recently, in the last 20 years or so, I guess, that we finally figured out how a bumblebee could fly. As weird as that sounds. Mainly because the wing size to the shape of the bumblebee was simply out of proportion. The bumblebee seemed too heavy for its little wings to be able to lift it. And we're not talking about like the little honeybees, we're talking like the big old fat bumblebees, the big furry ones. And it was only when we could actually do high-speed cameras that we could actually identify what was taking place. Because before then, we were just kind of assuming that the wings were just going straight up and down. But they weren't. They were actually kind of doing this rotating pattern, which created a vortex, which ended up making a greater power of lift for the bumblebee than what would normally happen. Nothing supernatural going on. We just didn't understand it. Same thing for like shooting stars would fall in this category as well for our ancestors. Oh man, did you see that happen? That doesn't happen very often. What it took was just us understanding what was going on. All right, so magic, sleight of hand, its power is human. You have somebody that's pulling a trick over you, right? They reach behind your ear, they pull out the quarter. It might be unnatural, like quarters don't normally come out of your ear. If you do, congratulations. But it normally doesn't happen. It's controlled by a human. And you see that with a rabbit in a hat. So how do you do the rabbit in a hat? A couple ways you can do it. One of the most popular ways is, as they're putting the hat down onto the table, so spoiler alert, the rabbit is actually usually in a bag at the front of the table that you can't see as the crowd. And so when they put the hat down, they'll lay it down, then they'll flip it really quick, and that bag will flip into the hat. Now there's a rabbit in the hat. So when he reaches in, pulls out a rabbit. Kind of takes away the mystery once you know how that works, huh? Again, completely natural. Psychosomatic, mind over matter, we've already talked about that, mind over the body. It does require a measure of faith. You actually have to have a positive attitude on things. It does have a high failure rate as well. In many ways, it almost doesn't matter how positive your thoughts are. If your body is riddled with cancer, that really, you're going to need something else. It really is going to take the power of God or chemo or whatever it is that God is using to try and heal you. But we do have accounts of people's whose positive attitudes do actually help. Their faith in God, their faith in Christ actually does contribute to their rate at which they can heal. This might be related more to the placebo effect. Have you ever had that experience? Here, take this right here and you'll feel better. And they say, oh man, I do feel better. And what you gave them was like a capsule full of like, not NyQuil or Dayquil or anything like that, but actually Nesquik. Right? You do this with your kids, right? It's like, oh, we did this here. I'm going to embarrass my son real quick. So when he was a kid, we would get him to eat his green beans by saying, you can dip your ketchup into it and make them green fries. Well, I like French fries, sure. So he would eat his green beans. That's how we got, it was a placebo effect. And all of a sudden, they tasted better. Sorry, love you, David. Anyway, he's like, stop speaking about me. You're making it worse. Let's see here. Satanic signs, these are evil powers. They tend to be more psychic in nature or have more Satan working behind it. It does actually have this kind of trait of evil, falsehood, the occult. It is limited in its power, however. It is supernatural, but it's limited. Like there seems to be a hard limit in what the satanic signs can do. You can think back to Pharaoh's magicians. They were able to copy several of the miracles that Moses was bringing about, God was working through Moses to bring about. But it stopped at a certain point. What point was that? Creation of life. This is the finger of God. There is a point at which these satanic signs end up stopping. And so the example would be something like demonic influence. So you'll have like occultic practices. Providence itself, these are the prearranged natural events. They have a divine power, but the way they work is actually through natural explanations. But they are often given a spiritual context. So the example I want to give for that one is like, are you familiar with like Johnny Erickson Tata?
Yes.
Okay. So if you're familiar with, if you're not familiar with her, she is quadriplegic. When she was like 19, 20 years old, she ended up diving into a shallow pool of water and like snapping her neck at the base of her skull, and so she is paralyzed from the neck down. So she was jumping off a boat into a muddy pool of water whenever she broke her neck, and of course she can't pull herself out of the water. Why did she not drown in that shallow pool? Well, it just so happened that right after she dived into the water, her sister that was swimming with her was getting out of the water when a crab nipped her toe. Just kind of pissed her toe and was like, ow! And she turned around because she was going to tell Johnny, oh, hey, be careful, the crabs are biting. She didn't see her. Instead, what she did see was underneath the surface, she saw this blonde, bleached blonde colored hair kind of floating in the water, like just underneath the surface. And she knew something was wrong. But beyond that, that was even Johnny's natural colored hair. The night before, she had dyed her hair that bleached color because she wanted to have a change up. She had what she called mousy brown hair. She didn't like it very much. But if she had had the mousy brown hair, when her sister turned around, guess what she would not have seen? That bright, white, bleached blonde hair. So, after her sister rescues her, she's able to revive her, but obviously she's quadriplegic. She went through several years of deep depression. I mean, wouldn't you? I mean, here you are in the prime of your life, and now you are, this athlete, you're a diver, and all of a sudden you can't even move. You are completely reliant on other people to move you around, to pick you up, clean you up. That's depressing. But yet, through this tragedy, she has been able to touch many different lives about the power of God and His mercy. She has become an accomplished, not only author, and speaker, but also an artist. You know, putting a paintbrush in her mouth, she's able to like paint landscapes. Really good. She paints better with her mouth than I do with my hand, which is, quite humbling. Now, this event of her life being spared so that she can inspire millions and millions of people and be able to preach the gospel to millions and millions of people, was that miraculous, or was that providence? It has more of the characteristics of providence. But now she'll consider it a miracle. You know what? I'm not going to fight her on it. Was it God that touched that crab to pinch her sister at just the right moment? But of course, you also ask, why didn't He just prevent her from not breaking her neck in the first place? We'll actually talk about those type of issues when we get to the problem of evil, which will be towards the end of this section. So lastly, this is where we're going to be closing at, is this idea of miracles. Miracles are these divine acts. They are supernaturally directed. They are unnatural. They would never and cannot happen when nature is left to its own devices. They are immediate. They are used to praise God and deliver a message from God. You can see this particularly in the ministry of Christ. So that's how we're going to be identifying what a miracle is. And so whenever we see claims from other religions talking about miracles, well, we can put it under scrutiny. What do you mean by miracle? Is it an actual miracle? So whenever a Muslim says, hey, Islam has miracles. What is the miracle of Islam? Does anybody happen to know? There's only one that is listed. The Quran itself. Well, wait a minute. Why is that a miracle? Well, because they'll say, well, because Muhammad was an illiterate man, he couldn't write a book. Well, wait a minute. There's a lot of people that can speak really well and, have other people write the book. Why is that a miracle? So I think they're being a bit loose with the term there. But whenever you talk about, Christ who says, destroy this body or destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it, and he does that through the resurrection, that's when the disciples were, oh, that temple must have been the temple of his body. Well, that has all the earmarks of a miracle. All right. I'm going to go ahead and stop there because it's after time. All right, comments, questions, concerns? Again, thank you for being here. I hope you're getting something out of this. You don't necessarily need to, as Darren has pointed out a couple times, you don't have to go into all this great detail. The purpose of apologetics is twofold. Number one is to encourage you in your faith so that you can give reasons for the hope that are within you. And secondly, it is that kind of, you might say, intellectual healing ministry that's supposed to just remove the barriers to believe. At the end of the day, none of this is going to convince anybody to believe. What we're trying to do is just show people the reason they don't believe is because it's a matter of the heart and the will. It's not a matter of the mind. They think it is, but it's not. Okay?